Okay. So, hi again and welcome. I'm Dr. Vikki Terrile. I think I have Arabic captions on, so just let me fix that. Give me 1 second. Okay, let's try that again. Okay. And the recording is going. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm just agenda-wise. Once I start sharing my presentation, I can't see any of you, but do feel free to put questions in the chat. I'm going to try to, I will definitely leave 10 minutes at the end, both for questions and to make sure that we all get to the closing session as quickly as possible, because I know how excited I am to see him, and I'm sure you all are too. So we'll go ahead and share. What I would ask, though, is if somebody can give me a verbal shout out once I start sharing my presentation, that you can see the slides. Are we good?
Yep, you got it.
Thank you. So I am Dr. Vikki Terrile. I am on the faculty of the GSLIS at Queens College CUNY, and I am also I was a public librarian, academic librarian, and for almost 20 years now, I've been working with children and families experiencing homelessness in shelters in New York City. I did that, so yay. And thank you so much to SJSU for sponsoring and being a founding partner for this conference. So I get a Google News alert every day about student homelessness and family homelessness. And I've been noticing for the last 9 months-ish or so that at least 2 or 3 times a week, I see a headline from all over the country saying something like this, that there are record numbers of students experiencing homelessness in a particular county or city all over the country. So if you look here, these are all actual headlines from online newspapers since November of last year. And these are the kinds of things that we're seeing, that across the country, schools, shelters, organizations are reporting, unsurprisingly, record numbers of youth and families experiencing homelessness. Now, many of you may have been in the previous session that my colleague and friend Julie Winkelstein was doing about youth homelessness. I'm going to be talking specifically about family homelessness, which may include youth, right? It may include teenagers, but these are minor children with a parent or parents who are experiencing homelessness. One of the things that I think may be shocking about these headlines is that for most people, family homelessness, childhood homelessness is invisible, right? It's not something that we see that often for a variety of reasons. Predominantly, that families do as much as they can because of stigma and other reasons to hide their homelessness. So it isn't as visible. Families that are experiencing homelessness look like every other family, right? And this often is related to fear of social services intervention, right? Of having your child removed because of neglect and those kinds of issues. So there is widespread family homelessness around the country that often is just completely invisible to the general public. You'll hear me talk about children or families experiencing homelessness rather than saying unhoused. And I was so excited when Schoolhouse Connection put this white paper out last spring, because as we'll see in a minute, most young people and their parents who are experiencing homelessness as families are housed. They are sharing, residences with friends or family. They're couch surfing, they're doubled, tripled, quadrupled up. They're staying in hotels or motels. They have housing. Sometimes that housing lasts for a, significant amount of time, even though it's temporary, quote unquote. But they have housing, and those families are still considered homeless. So I will use the phrase experiencing homelessness, generally speaking. I also do that because it's people first language, right? For almost everyone who experiences homelessness, it's a temporary, transitional kind of experience. It's not a defining kind of trait. So it's something that people experience. It doesn't define who they are. So here are some numbers, and I hope these numbers are shocking. they should be. And I'm going to be blunt and say that they are absolutely an undercount. These are numbers that are identified through school districts and other organizations around the country, which means that these are the children whose families have somehow stepped up to identify themselves as homeless, which often doesn't happen, right? A family that's staying with grandma because they can't afford their own place may not see themselves as homeless even at the start of the school year when they get the registration form that asks about their housing situation. So this is absolutely an undercount. There's also an overlap. So you'll see, right, that this first number, which is a little bit more recent, and I have a feeling when we get the data for the 2022-23 school year, that's going to be even higher, includes pre-K, and then the much older data. So this is pre-pandemic, so that number is going to be much higher, is ages 0 to 6. Most children who experience homelessness are little kids, right? They're under age 6. So even though we have this overlap and the years are slightly off, I'm going to go with this, combined number still probably being an undercount of where we are right now in terms of childhood homelessness in the US. So I mentioned that the invisibility piece for a lot of families is that they're not in shelters, right? They're not in one place where it would be easy to count them. They're often doubled up. The statistics, the 77% is pretty accurate. So, figure, depending on the community, 2/3 to 3/4 of children who are identified through their school district, and I'm going to talk about how that works in a second, are doubled up. So this means that they are living with another family. So this could be friends, it could be relatives, for financial reasons. It's not that they're, the grandma's living with them because, she wants to watch them and it worked out for everybody. It's that they don't have any other financial choice. And the rule that educators use for this is, if the family had all the money in the world, would this still be the housing situation that they would choose to live in? What makes this number so different from other counts of homelessness, and if you look at, the national numbers, they are much less than the, 1.2 and 1.4 million total, right, that we just talked about, is that they are counting this doubled up number. When we're looking at adults who are experiencing homelessness, and even families that are staying in shelters that are funded through the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, they're counting sheltered and unsheltered folks. They're not looking at doubled up students and families. However, the US Department of Education does, which is where we get these numbers. And I'm going to spend, a little chunk of time on this, really because with those doubled up families being the largest population of kids experiencing homelessness, your McKinney-Vento liaison, who I'm going to talk about a lot in just a second, is going to be your best entry point to trying to reach and serve those families. So I mentioned McKinney-Vento. McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act is the legislation that provides protections in a bunch of different ways, but in particular, when we're talking about kids and families, it protects their educational rights. So it sets a whole bunch of things in place that allows children who are unstably housed to stay in school and to have extra protections. And I've got these links here. The Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, this is the National Center for Homeless Education. It used to be at, I think it still is, at one of the North Carolina universities. I've been having a problem accessing their website, so I'm not sure if that link is actually going to work for you. I don't know if it's my computer or if it's a bigger problem with them, but I just want to give you a heads up about that. McKinney-Vento allows for a number of different things. This is the definition. So this is how homelessness is defined. So I mentioned this piece about sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. That piece is missing from other counts of homelessness that you'll see. This is why those numbers are so much higher when we're talking about kids, particularly, school age children, than other populations within the population of people experiencing homelessness. But the real focus, and this is kind of true across all definitions of homelessness, is that it means lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So I know in one of the sessions I was in, folks were talking about um, people in their communities like sleeping in their cars or camping. That counts, right? Those are clearly families experiencing homelessness, and they technically should be counted by their local school district and given provisions. And what are those provisions? I will tell you. They are entitled to enroll immediately in school. So the way it works is if you become homeless as a family, you can choose whatever is in the best interest of the child as far as where that child is going to school. So if you are staying with a cousin in a neighboring school district, but you feel like you're definitely at some point when you can move back to that original district, so it's in your student's best interest not to change schools, it is absolutely your right as a parent to have that child stay in the school they were in, even though you're now living in a different school district. You can also choose to have that child enroll in the school district where you are living temporarily, whether it's in shelter or if you're in a hotel or doubled up. And if that's the case, the school district is required to register your child regardless of whether you have any of the typically required kind of documents around like birth certificate, vaccination records, those kinds of things. If any of you are familiar with this, there's been a big controversy in the state of Pennsylvania, and they were the ones that the study focused on, but I'm sure this is going on everywhere, that schools were not registering students who were identified as homeless correctly and immediately because they thought that parents were trying to scam the system by, faking residence in a better district, and they're in a whole bunch of trouble for that. Again, this goes up to the parent or guardian, right? What is in the child's best interest? If they decide to stay in their school of origin and they are living outside of that school district, the two school districts have to negotiate the transportation. It's not up to the parent to provide the transportation. Under McKinney-Vento, kids who are identified as McKinney-Vento eligible get free school meals without having to fill out the paperwork or proving their income. In many schools, McKinney-Vento comes with mini grant, sub-grant funding for school districts, and a lot of that is used towards supporting things like, field trips and uniform fees and those kinds of things. I give you all of that as background because the most important piece of this is that every school district in the United States, or an LEA, a local educational agency, must assign somebody to be the McKinney-Vento liaison. They can be everything from the transportation coordinator. They could be, an assistant principal in a school. They might be an assistant superintendent or a social worker. They might, in a large enough district, that could be their job, right? They could be the McKinney-Vento liaison. They are the person who is the point person for families to contact if they're having issues. They collect the data when families register, and they also report data to their state. So more recently, over the last few years, states have been required to report the educational outcomes for homeless students the same way they report the educational outcomes for students with disabilities, English language learners, migrant students. I'm probably missing some. So you should be able at the state level to track that data. McKinney-Vento liaisons will know what's going on in your community, right? They will know that you have perhaps large numbers of unaccompanied homeless youth. Maybe they're migrant youth who are, here by themselves, reuniting with other family members. Maybe they're kids where mom or dad, is having legal issues or drug issues or whatever the case may be. So they're staying temporarily and unofficially, not like as an official foster situation with, a relative or a family member. They'll also know that these are the organizations that families are using, right? They'll have that level of information to be, and be willing to share it in an aggregated kind of way. Finding your McKinney-Vento liaison is not that hard, although I will say that there's a good amount of turnover. There's both the link to a separate PowerPoint and the URL, the QR code, excuse me, that explains kind of step by step how to do this with an example of how I found the McKinney-Vento liaison for St. Louis, Missouri. Okay. So I'm going to quickly switch gears to some of the educational outcomes for students experiencing homelessness. As we've been talking about all day, homelessness, the experience of homelessness is deeply traumatizing, especially for young children. It's associated with delays in their learning, with their social emotional development. And these are delays that linger, right? So we're talking about trauma that's happening to kids in those really formative years of early childhood, especially. So we see things like, 2 to 3 years after exiting homelessness, kids are still behind their peers on a lot of assessments. And that has to do with, and I'm talking about things like ELA, reading assessments, right? They're underperforming compared to other populations of students who typically perform, you know, less well. And I'm just, I completely understand the problem with these tests. I get it. But to point out that there are lingering impacts on children's learning when they experience homelessness in childhood. More than half of students who experience homelessness are chronically absent. So they're missing a ton of school. So on top of the trauma and that's impact on development and learning, just missing school and the disruptions to their education is problematic, which ultimately leads to only 68% of students who identify as homeless actually graduate from high school. This is significantly less than low income students, and it's significantly less than the general population of students. It's actually the lowest graduation rate for any subgroup whose outcomes are currently being measured by the state and federal departments of education. So, what does this mean for us in libraries? A few things. The first is that even if you don't have a family shelter in your community, you absolutely have families who are experiencing homelessness. You're likely not going to know, but it's important to be aware that they exist, because the policies that we have in place around things like library cards will adversely impact families, particularly families who are doubled up. So, for example, if a family is staying with a friend or a relative, they may not be allowed to receive mail, right? So even if you have the process where you can just send, like I worked in a library, we would send you a postcard, and once you got it in the mail, you'd bring it back in, and that served as your proof of residence. If you're living with somebody else and like you being there is technically a violation of their lease, assuming they have a lease, or it's going to get them in trouble with the landlord, and you're all kind of on the DL, you're not going to be able to get mail there. You're certainly not going to have official state documentation or identification that has that. So when we think about policy, even families that are fairly stably housed, in the sense that they may be living with relatives for a prolonged period of time, may not be able to, meet those kinds of requirements. But what we see looking at their educational needs is that these are absolutely related to library services. They are completely connected to the kinds of initiatives around reading and literacy that we're already working on. So early childhood reading, summer reading, homework help, and after school, all of those things would be hugely beneficial for families experiencing homelessness. And then I mentioned the McKinney-Vento folks as a point of contact to get started in finding out what's going on in your community and understanding family homelessness, and then looking at those opportunities, right? So if most of your families are doubled up, are there organizations that they're working with? Does the school district do something like, like a weekend food backpack kind of thing that the library could get involved with? Where are the opportunities for the library to push in and help meet these needs that are really, pretty traditional, straightforward library kinds of services? And then to wrap up, I will just give a couple of suggestions. If your community does have family shelters and you haven't, thought about working with them, like I said, I've been doing this almost 20 years. I've done all kinds of programs that have been hugely successful. Back in the day, back in 2012, Adam Gidwitz, before he was a rock star, when he was first starting out, did a free program, a book discussion for tweens at one of the shelters I worked with. Right, so we read the book together, and then he came in and talked to the kids, signed their books. It was a huge, big thing. I've also done sensory story times with kids in shelters, and again, this all depends on the specific needs of a shelter in a particular community. This shelter I worked with quite a bit had an on-site daycare, but the kids were definitely showing some developmental delays. So all of my storytime programming was reinforcing skills and then doing fun things. So those are, I don't know if you can tell, it's like dyed beans and rice and things for them to play with. But kind of reinforcing and doing the same kind of sensory story time we might do in the library. Right now, I don't want you to forget the parents. Right now, I'm working with a number of shelters locally, and we're doing book discussions with the moms for Wash Day Diaries. And Jamila Rouser has been fabulous and is going to answer some questions via video from the parents. It's going to be a surprise. I'm really excited. And the parents love doing arts and crafts because if you have a shelter, a lot of the programming for parents is very punitive and prescriptive, right? It's get a job. This is how you budget money. This is how you write your resume, right? All those kinds of things. And they are all under tremendous stress and trauma themselves, and things like arts and crafts. So this was a spray painting project with like little spray bottles with the kids. And one of the moms painted this giant board that they're now using in the shelter as decorations. And the kids on another day did all the little octopuses. Okay. I think that was my last slide. Let me come out of here to ask questions. Okay. So I'm looking the chat, the question from Mallory. So one of the major problems, and the reason that I recommend outreach, at least as a starting point, is that transportation is a huge problem for a lot of families. So even in New York City, where we talk about there's a library within a mile of every person in the city, that mile might mean crossing a 4-lane highway, or it might be like, it's 90 degrees here. Walking a mile with like 2 little kids in a stroller is just not feasible. So I think the idea of the outreach gets around some of those barriers and starts to get families familiar and comfortable with the library. I've had a lot of parents, when I've done library card visits over the years in shelters, tell me that they were treated really badly in the library trying to get a library card because they didn't have the right documentation, the right paperwork. So to me, the outreach piece is giving them a friendly face to associate with libraries, giving them a sense of what libraries have to offer, so that if they do have the transportation option and can get to the library easily, it builds that. And then, they're not going to stay in shelter forever. So wherever they move to, they may now be more likely to, seek out the library and understand the resources there and have a sense of familiarity with the library too. The other issue, though, sometimes with outreach thank you. Yeah, Haley, absolutely. That outreach doesn't always change those barriers, right? So the fact that like families are often unable to, if they have a car, they may have like just enough gas to get to school or get to work. Doing that outreach doesn't change the fact that there's not good public transportation, or that there's not more resources sort of centralized in one place, so that families don't have to make multiple trips for things that are overlapping, right? So that's something that I would recommend. Let me pop the McKinney Vento link in there. Give me 1 second. don't feel bad about McKinney-Vento. It's primarily related to schools, and most people who work in schools have never heard of it either. So they are lovely. I cold call and cold email McKinney-Vento people when I travel for conferences, when I visit places, all the time, and they are lovely and generous. And I think it's because nobody ever asks them what they do, and when they have someone they can talk to who like understands, like they're not going to give you details on particular kids, obviously, but they can certainly give you that overview and let you know like what the needs are in the community, that it may not be as easy for um you know for folks who don't know to do. Deborah, school libraries, I would say the same thing. I would find out like who, talk to your McKinney-Vento person in your district, because they may have a, I'm sure they have a relationship if there's a local family shelter. And so that you're not stepping on toes, see who their point person is, and then, go from there and see what their needs are, right? Like they may, you know, I've worked with shelters that already had really robust programming that maybe didn't need push in outreach story times and stuff, but then there are some that had like no services whatsoever, and even like a weekly or bi-weekly or monthly story time for the families was a big deal. So a lot of it is going to be dependent on your community and the providers. I'm trying to read this. Give me 1 second. Gail, I've always said I've been a librarian for over 26 years, and my entire career from when I started out in a suburban library was connecting to people and being part of their lives. I got to admit, I'm not great myself with boundaries, but being involved in people, knowing, having regular patrons, knowing people's, what's going on in their lives to the extent that they're comfortable sharing is a huge, I mean, to me, it's like why I do this. It's what I've always done. Able to listen. So Misty, that's a really interesting, I've never heard of that before. And that's pretty amazing. So I will, Mallory, just to wrap up before I let us all go and hear Michael. Homelessness by itself is not a form of neglect. If, however, the parent has like disappeared and the kid has not made any kind of um, arrangements for their child, then that would be something. So some of it's dependent. If they're staying with a family member and the family member is expecting this to be long term, even if it's not an official family kinship foster care model, they're not going to get into trouble as far as neglect per se, but it is but they would be counted as homeless, as unaccompanied homeless youth. When I was, so right now I'm faculty, so I kind of do this through my department and my stuff. Most of my outreach was just through my regular budget, although more and more libraries are developing outreach departments that are sort of centralizing this work, which is a good approach, because when I left, I don't know how much, I don't think any of the stuff that I was doing continued. My email, let me put my email in here quickly because I want us all to go and hear the closing. And please feel free to email me. I could talk about this for days, and I totally do. But if you have questions that I didn't get to, or need advice or recommendations on how to get started, absolutely let me know. Thank you. Enjoy the closing speech. Thanks so much for being here.